Hi everyone, my name is Rosie Masui. I work at the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Homer, Alaska. And today we're going to be doing a presentation talking about harmful algal blooms and seabirds. The need for this presentation and this short video has really come about from some recent harmful algal bloom events that have been happening in the state of Alaska. Most recently on the 4th of July, when a harmful algal bloom event led to a paralytic shellfish poisoning fatality in Unalaska. From that event specifically, there has been quite a few questions that have been coming to us at the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve and to the larger Alaska Harmful Algal Bloom Network community about harmful algal blooms, the impacts they can have on humans, and then also the potential impacts that they can have on other critters within the marine ecosystem. First, I want to mention the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. We are the only research reserve that is part of a national program, but we are the only one located in the state of Alaska. To be a research reserve, you have to have your federal and your state partner. Our federal partners are NOAA and the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. And then our state partner is the University of Alaska, Alaska Center for Conservation Science. Our specific program that looks at harmful algal blooms is our Harmful Algal Bloom Community Monitoring Program. There's me there on the left-hand side, and then Jasmine Maurer, both work to coordinate this program, working with around 45 different community monitors throughout South Central Alaska, and more recently outside, to monitor for harmful algal blooms, primarily through phytoplankton monitoring and shellfish monitoring. If you have any questions about our monitoring program, at the end I'm going to share a website. Feel free to reach out to us. But this talk is really specifically about harmful algal blooms and seabirds. Before we get into the seabird components, I wanted to first walk through this definition of what harmful algal blooms are. So this is a definition from NOAA, and since some of our partners might be just listening to this, I'm actually going to read this out for folks. Harmful algal blooms, or HABs, occur when colonies of algae, simple plants that live in the sea and freshwater, grow out of control and produce toxic or harmful effects on people, fish, shellfish, marine mammals, and birds. The human illnesses caused by HABs, although rare, can be debilitating or even fatal. For the purpose of this talk and for our community monitoring program, we are primarily focused on marine harmful algal blooms. And those are phytoplankton that really in the marine environment are really a great food source within the marine ecosystem. They're often thought of as the base of the food web in the marine environment. It's just some of those species can or do contain toxins, which can lead to problems. Some species can also cause some problems even without the toxins. So historically in the state of Alaska, the main concern around harmful algal blooms has been because of toxin accumulation in shellfish. This illustration done by Conrad Field, who also works at the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, over here on the right-hand side is a great illustration. So it's showing a type of clam that is filtering out some phytoplankton that it's eating. This species of phytoplankton happens to contain toxins. And it kind of goes back to that idea of you are what you eat. So as this clam is filtering and eating those species of phytoplankton that contain toxins, that leads to that clam then being toxic. So if someone then eats that clam, it can have really negative effects like different types of shellfish poisoning. So historically, this has been one of our main concerns. But our concerns have been growing because there's been a lot of thoughts about, well, what kind of impacts are harmful algal blooms having on other species in the ecosystem? To talk about that, we have a few folks joining us today, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves, and then we are going to get into asking them a few different questions about harmful algal blooms and seabirds. So to kick us off, Rob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Rob Kaler. I'm based in Anchorage, working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Division of Migratory Bird Management. I'm a seabird specialist, and since 2015, as unusual mortality events of seabirds become annual events, not so unusual anymore, I've been coordinating that response for migratory bird management. I've worked out in the West Aleutians, and I work in Prince William Sound also for the Gulf Watch Alaska, lead the Marine Bird Survey project following up to the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustees Council.
Great, thanks, Rob. Now, Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Sarah Schoen, and I work at the USGS Alaska Science Center in Anchorage. And I study seabirds and forage fish with our Seabird Forage Fish and Marine Ecology program. And I've worked throughout Alaska from Southeast and Glacier Bay, Icy Bay, and Yakutat Bay up to South Central and Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet, and throughout the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula too. And I've been studying different aspects of foraging biology, population biology, and then recently looking more into die-offs and the effect of HAB toxins on seabirds.
Well, thanks, Rob, and thanks, Sarah, for joining us today to answer some folks' questions and try to help answer some of these questions around harmful algal blooms and seabirds. The first question that I want to ask is, can harmful algal blooms have negative impacts on seabirds?
Yeah, they certainly have been shown to in different instances. HAB toxins have been implicated as the cause of death in some cases, and they've been shown to affect the waterproofing ability of birds. They can cause hypothermia. They can render the birds unable to lay eggs and affect their motor control. They've also caused vomiting and intestinal distress in some birds, paralysis, circulatory issues, and respiratory distress in different cases.
Thank you. So where have harmful algal blooms had a confirmed negative impact on seabirds?
So from the literature, it looks like there's a lot of different places, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but we've seen negative impacts in Alaska, in Washington, Oregon, California, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Florida, even Canada, England, South Africa.
So this is something that we have definitely seen in the state of Alaska before, though.
Yeah, there are a couple cases, only one in the literature that I'm aware of right now that I can talk about a little bit later in specifics, but there have been a few instances and then one last year that have been confirmed cases of effects of PSP on birds.
Thanks, Sarah. Are there visual indications that a seabird is being impacted by harmful algal blooms?
Yeah, so you probably have to be there at the right place in the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time to see this happening. But some of those issues that I was describing earlier, if you happen to be there, you might see some neurological signs or some intestinal issues with the bird, behavioral issues. So if you saw any of those, it could be an indicator that the seabird is being affected by HAB toxins, but it can be confusing because some of those same issues can also happen because of starvation or other factors.
Thanks, Sarah. What are some species of seabirds that have been impacted in the past by harmful algal blooms?
There have been a lot of different birds in the literature that have been attributed to being affected by harmful algal blooms. I've got a long list here: the terns, cormorants, pelicans, murres, kittiwakes, loons, fulmars, grebes, gulls, puffins, shearwaters, albatross, oyster catchers, merlets, multiple different sea ducks, and penguins even.
Wow. Has there been an event in Alaska where harmful algal blooms have negatively impacted seabirds? And where did this happen and what happened?
So the first documented case was on Kodiak Island. There were some nest cameras for Kitlitz's murrelet nests, and this little seabird, they breed solitarily, kind of spaced out among the landscape, and they had cameras on the nest to look at the birds and see how the chicks were developing. And they actually found that they watched the adults feed the birds some sand lance, and the chicks died right afterwards. And that happened over a couple different years. And when the bird tissues of the chicks that had died and also the fish were sent back to the National Wildlife Health Center, they had those tissues tested for pathology and for toxins. And they determined that the chicks had died from poisoning from saxitoxin, which is that paralytic shellfish poisoning toxin. And then recently, this last summer, there was a die-off of Arctic terns in Juneau. About 60 birds had died. And several of those birds, and then also a couple of fish from that event, were sent to the National Wildlife Health Center. And then those tissues were sent back to our lab at USGS, and we tested them and found saxitoxin in the tissues of those birds, and the pathologist at the National Wildlife Health Center determined that those had died from, again, from poisoning from saxitoxin.
Wow, so this is definitely a recent issue that's been happening in the state of Alaska for folks to think about. If there is a seabird die-off event happening in an Alaskan coastal community, so there is a chance that harmful algal blooms could have been involved.
Yeah, there is a chance. There are a lot of die-offs. It's kind of a regular part of seabird life cycles, and they are not often attributed to toxins from harmful algal blooms, but it is a possibility for sure. And we're just, as water's warm and these harmful algal blooms become more prevalent in Alaska, it's something we definitely should keep our eyes on and pay attention to, because it could become more of an issue up here.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So this next question, I think I'm gonna ask for Rob. And this is, so if I see seabirds acting weird or washing up dead on the beach, who should I contact to investigate this further? And what kind of information is going to be needed for me to pass along to folks?
Yeah, that's something that we've really been working at, getting reports from communities, particularly far-flung communities, perhaps in the Bering Strait region, where we really don't have a large presence of federal or state folks or tribal partners to help coordinate the collection of that information and pass it back into Fish and Wildlife Service so that we can help track these seabird die-offs with regard to the mortality event being measured by more, magnitude, geographic extent, as well as the duration, how long that event is happening. So we do have a direct hotline, 1-866-527-3358. And Rosie, you'll provide this as well as another resource. And we can also receive emails to ak_mbm@fws.gov. And so those are two ways to directly report to Fish and Wildlife Service if you see any sick or dying or dead seabirds or any birds. These numbers will get to us. There's often regional representatives that you can also report to. So for example, in Homer, Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, or even Fish and Game in Homer, or wherever you might be living, there are resources to help report that. And specifically, if you do encounter dead or dying seabirds, information, the most useful, and I'll give this in kind of the order of importance, but location, where you observed the dead or dying birds, the time that you saw them, and the date. So did you see them in the morning on the, and then I put it on a little calendar over here on the side of my desk that says, on 23 July, we got a report from Kachemak Bay of, and so this is where the next information, where were you looking? How large of an area? Were you walking your dog for about a mile? And in that 1 mile stretch, which is an approximation, how many horned puffins, or if you don't know which species they are, But you know they're seabirds. They've got webbed feet, and there was about, you know, maybe 35 of them. And so that can be an estimate, but essentially kind of a rough idea of how many you observed, where you saw them, when you saw them, and then an additional ask is photographs. So if we get those photographs, we work with the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey team based out of University of Washington, but they do long-term beach monitoring throughout Alaska. And they've got some very gifted birders who can take photos, even if the photo, the bird doesn't have a head and it's been scavenged by a predator. Charlie, for example, can still tell you, well, that looks like a common murre, or at least it's a, I don't know if it's thick-billed or common, but it's a murre. So, and then if you do see unusual behavior, so the bird is pecking in the sand, acting drunk or incoherent, lacks predator avoidance, that's an indication that the bird's not doing well. Sick or just compromised, lack of food, perhaps they've been exposed to harmful algal bloom biotoxins, which I think, you know, it's a neurotoxin, so it affects the behavior. And the last ask would be getting videos of that behavior and sending those to us is also really useful.
Great, thanks, Rob. It's good to kind of have some examples thinking about those potential behaviors for folks to keep their eyes out for. And then, is it okay to touch dead birds that I see on the beach with my bare hands if I notice them, or if I'm trying to move them around for a photo? Is that okay? And then, are there any recommendations for harvesting seabirds that are found dead on the beach?
As a general practice, yes, I'd have to encourage everybody not to touch anything dead or dying with their bare hands. For the last few years, the cause of death has been determined to be starvation, but our first effort is always to rule out a disease event, and that can be infectious or non-infectious disease, and that's why we collaborate with trained partners in the communities to collect freshly dead carcasses, freeze them, send them to us, and never putting that freshly collected carcass in with their food. They have access to a biological specimen freezer, so we rely on people like you, Rosie, or folks at the Alaska Maritime and Homer to make sure that you're not putting that food in there, but always using personal protective equipment. And it's similar to harvesting of you know, subsistence foods, where you want to practice best management. Don't smoke while you're handling, don't drink, don't eat while you're handling these things. But in general, if you see a dead bird, I would recommend using protective equipment before you actually touch it. Again, we think that these birds have died due to starvation, but we always want to be able to rule out disease and make sure that if it is a disease event, that we can then follow up quickly on that. So, and then with regard to taking, you know, nature will take its course as well. And so often we get a report, and if by the time we request that some trained individual go out and actually collect carcasses, the beach might be wiped completely clean just because of a tide or a wind or both, essentially. So.
Great, thanks, Rob. I appreciate answering those questions, especially thinking that if there was to be another die-off event that would potentially happen, it's great for folks to think about those classic personal protective equipment that might be great to kind of wear if you were trained to handle those different birds. So then the last question that I have, I think we'll throw for Sarah to answer is, what research or monitoring efforts do you have planned for the future?
Yeah, so our program at USGS has a couple projects upcoming that we've been funded for. Caroline Van Hemert and Matt Smith run our harmful algal bloom lab at USGS, and they're going to continue to test tissues from die-off birds that are sent to them from the National Wildlife Health Center, mostly from die-offs coordinated through Rob normally and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So they'll test those for biotoxins. And then Matt Smith is also going to lead a captive dosing study at the Sea Life Center to look at the effect of saxitoxin on common murres. And I'm going to be leading a project looking at the presence of saxitoxin and domoic acid, another harmful algal bloom toxin, in seabird feces across a large part of Alaska. So that'll be from samples when we capture birds from our own projects, as well as a lot of different partners will be capturing birds and sharing their samples with us. And then our last project is looking at the harmful algal bloom toxins across marine food webs. So we're going to be looking at saxitoxin and domoic acid again, and looking at members of the food web from mussels and zooplankton to fish and seabirds. And we're going to try to compare the toxin levels across those different trophic groups, and then see if we can see different levels over time, see if there's any biodilution or bioaccumulation. And we're going to be trying to target really high toxin events for those samples.
Great, Sarah. It's really great to know that as we're talking to you and Rob and hearing about how harmful algal blooms can have some large negative impacts on seabirds, to know that there are some research and monitoring efforts happening in the state of Alaska. Well, thank you guys so much for joining and talking with me. I think now to wrap up, I just wanted to share a couple of different resource pages for folks. So we will be having this video along with resources from both Rob at Fish and Wildlife and Sarah at USGS, located at two different websites. The first is the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve's community monitoring website page, and that's the link that you can add into your browser. You can also access this by Googling KBNERR space community space monitoring, and it should pop up right away. Another link where this video will be present along with those resources will also be the Alaska Ocean Observing System's Alaska Harmful Algal Bloom Network website. That's the link, the second link listed. And it's also listed if you go to Google and you type in AOOS space AHAB space videos, and that should be the first link that pops up for you. And so with that, I just wanted to say thanks again to Rob and Sarah. If anybody has any questions through both of those websites, you can reach out and get connected with either myself or folks at the Alaska Harmful Algal Bloom Network, who can help connect you with either Rob or Sarah or other experts to answer any other questions you may have. This is the first of a few videos that we are going to be having and sharing. In a couple weeks, we will be sharing a video talking about harmful algal blooms and their impacts on marine mammals that we'll be working with Kathy LaFay from NOAA to produce. So thanks you guys for listening, and please reach out if you have any questions.
Thanks, Rosie.